Some fathers leave their children money, others leave wisdom. But Sarah Ward left her family something that would take 30 years to understand. The night she died, a strange bulge appeared on the ancient oak tree in their backyard, growing slowly like a wooden pregnancy that made no earthly sense. Elias Ward spent 3 decades raising his son alone while watching that mysterious growth. He measured it each year, whispered to it when no one was looking, and wondered what his dying wife could have possibly hidden inside that tree. His neighbors called it cursed. His son called it Dad's obsession. But now, with his boy heading off to college and the house feeling emptier than ever, Elias finally takes an axe to that bulge. What spills out changes everything he thought he knew about love, loss, and the promises we make to those we leave behind. What could a dying mother hide inside a tree that would wait 30 years to reveal itself? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning coffee had grown cold in Elias Ward's weathered hands as he stood at the kitchen window, watching the sun filter through the massive oak tree that dominated his backyard. At 58, his body carried the accumulated aches of 3 decades spent fixing other people's problems. Leaky faucets, broken furnaces, and squeaky hinges that never seemed to stay quiet for long. His calloused fingers traced the rim of the ceramic mug, a wedding gift from Sarah that had somehow survived 30 years of morning rituals and midnight worries. The house around him bore the comfortable weight of a life lived fully, if not always, easily. Mismatched furniture told stories of thrift store discoveries and hand-me-downs from neighbors who knew a struggling single father when they saw one. The walls displayed Marcus's artwork from elementary school, alongside Sarah's delicate watercolors, faded now, but still capturing the gentle spirit that had once filled these rooms with laughter and hope. Elias set down his mug and reached for the stack of yellowed envelopes tied with a blue ribbon, Sarah's final letters to him, written during those last terrible months. He didn't need to read them anymore, to remember every word, every loop of her careful handwriting, every tear stain that had blurred the ink before it dried. But touching them had become as essential as breathing, a daily communion with the woman who had loved him completely and left far too soon. "My dearest Eli," the top letter began, just as it had for the past 11,000 mornings. "I know you're reading this by our kitchen window, probably wondering why I'm making you promise to keep these letters forever." She had known him so well, predicted his patterns with the tender accuracy that comes only from true partnership. The tree is watching over you both. Trust in what you cannot yet understand. Even then, dying and delirious with fever, Sarah had mentioned the tree. Elias folded the letter carefully and returned it to the stack, his eyes drawn once again to the oak's impossible bulk. The thing had been ancient when they bought the property 28 years ago, its trunk so wide that he and Marcus together couldn't wrap their arms around it. But it was the growth at its base that defied explanation. A wooden swelling the size of a wine barrel that had appeared the very night Sarah passed away. The first time he'd noticed it, 3 days after the funeral, Elias had assumed it was some kind of diseased growth, a burl that would need to be removed before it killed the tree. But when the county extension agent came out to examine it, the man had scratched his head and admitted he'd never seen anything quite like it. Structurally sound, he'd said, running his hands over the smooth, almost polished surface. Whatever caused it, the tree's adapting. Might be best to leave it alone. That had been 30 years ago. Since then, the bulge had grown slowly but steadily, adding perhaps an inch in diameter each year. Elias had taken to measuring it every autumn, on the anniversary of Sarah's death, marking the measurements in a worn leather journal that had once been hers. The ritual had become sacred to him, a way of honoring both her memory and the mystery she had somehow left behind. His neighbors on Elm Creek Road had their own opinions about the tree. Mrs. Peterson from next door crossed herself whenever she walked past their fence, muttering about unholy things and the dead not staying dead. Old Charlie Brennan insisted it was some kind of fungal infection that would spread to the other trees if Elias didn't do something about it. But Mrs. Chen, the elderly woman who lived in the cottage at the end of the road, would only smile mysteriously when asked about it and say something about old spirits finding their way home. Elias had never been superstitious, but he'd learned to respect the tree's strange presence. On difficult nights, when the house felt too empty and the weight of single parenthood threatened to crush him, he would sit on the back porch and talk to the oak as if Sarah could hear him. He told it about Marcus's first steps, his first day of school, his graduation from high school, his struggles and triumphs, and all the moments a mother should have witnessed. Sometimes, in the rustling of the leaves, he could almost hear her voice responding with love and encouragement. Marcus had grown up thinking this was normal behavior. To him, Dad talking to the tree was as natural as checking the weather or reading the morning paper. It wasn't until his teenage years that Marcus began to understand how his father's devotion to the oak appeared to outsiders. Friends would visit and whisper about the crazy tree guy, but Marcus had always defended his father with fierce loyalty. "He's not crazy," he would say. "He's just remembering Mom." The sound of footsteps on the creaky stairs pulled Elias from his reverie. Marcus appeared in the kitchen doorway, 30 years old now and preparing for the next chapter of his life. He moved with Sarah's graceful economy of motion, but his father's solid build and steady hands marked him clearly as Elias's son. Dark, a hair that never quite behaved properly framed, intelligent brown eyes that missed very little. "Morning, Dad," Marcus said, heading straight for the coffee pot. "You're up early again." "Couldn't sleep," Elias admitted, which was nothing new. Sleep had been elusive since Sarah's death, coming in fits and starts that left him tired but functional. "Figured I'd get started on the Petersons' bathroom sink before it gets too hot outside." Marcus poured his coffee and joined his father. At the window, both men looking out at the tree that had shaped their lives in ways neither fully understood. The morning light caught the bulge at its base, making the wood grain shimmer like water. "Stanford called yesterday," Marcus said quietly. "They've finalized my teaching assistantship for the fall semester, full ride, plus a small stipend for living expenses." Elias felt his chest tighten, pride and loss warring in his heart. He'd known this day was coming, had encouraged it, saved for it, sacrificed for it, but the reality still hit him like a physical blow. "That's wonderful, son. Your mother would be so proud." "I know you think I should stay," Marcus continued, his voice careful and measured. "Help you with the business, maybe settle down here like she did. But Dad, I need to see what's out there. I need to know who I am when I'm not just your son or her memory. You think I don't want that for you?" Elias turned to face his son, seeing Sarah's stubborn chin and determined expression. "You think I've been holding you back?" "Not intentionally," Marcus said, his tone gentle but firm. "But this house, this town, that tree, it's all about holding on to what's gone. I love you, Dad, and I loved Mom even though I barely remember her. But I can't build my life around someone else's grief." The words stung because they carried truth. Elias had built his world around preservation, around keeping Sarah's memory alive through routine and ritual. He read her letters every morning, maintained the tree with religious devotion, and structured his days around the patterns they'd established together. Change felt like betrayal, like letting her slip away completely. "The trees stopped growing," Elias said suddenly, the words surprising even him. Marcus frowned. "What do you mean?" "This year's measurement. Same as last year's, down to the millimeter. First time that's happened since it started." Elias retrieved the leather journal from the kitchen drawer, flipping to the most recent entries. 30 years of steady growth, and then nothing. Like it's finished with whatever it was doing. Marcus studied the careful measurements and notes his father had kept, The handwriting was precise, almost scientific in its attention to detail. Charts and diagrams showed the Bulge's progression over 3 decades, a visual testament to Elias's unwavering dedication. "Maybe it's time," Marcus said softly. "Maybe whatever Mom was trying to tell us, we're finally ready to hear it." Elias closed the journal with a snap. "Or maybe it's just a tree with a weird growth, and I've been talking to myself for 30 years like the crazy old fool Mrs. Peterson thinks I am." "You're not crazy, Dad, and you're not old." Marcus placed a hand on his father's shoulder. "But you are stuck. We both are, in different ways. Maybe my leaving will give you permission to move forward too." The suggestion hung in the air between them, loaded with implications neither was quite ready to explore. Elias had indeed grown comfortable with his patterns, his predictable rhythms of work and remembrance. The idea of change, of letting go, felt like stepping off a cliff into empty air. "I've been thinking about cutting it down," Elias admitted, the words feeling like blasphemy even as he spoke them. "The tree. If you're leaving anyway and it's stopped growing, maybe it's time to let go of whatever hold it has on us." Marcus's coffee mug froze halfway to his lips. In all his 30 years, he'd never heard his father suggest such a thing. The tree had been as permanent and unchanging as the sunrise, a constant presence that defined their little world. "You can't be serious," Marcus said. "Dad, that tree is what, a memorial? A shrine to my inability to move on?" Elias's voice carried decades of accumulated frustration. "Your mother is gone, Marcus. She's been gone for 30 years, and I've spent every one of those years talking to a piece of wood like it could bring her back. But what if it could?" The question slipped out before Marcus could stop it, revealing thoughts he'd carried but never voiced. What if she really did leave us something, and we're just too afraid to find out what it is? Elias stared at his son, seeing Sarah's fearless curiosity in his eyes. She had always been the one to chase mysteries, to believe in possibilities beyond the ordinary. Marcus had inherited that from her, along with her graceful hands and her way of tilting her head when she was thinking hard about something. "You really think there's something inside that bulge?" Elias asked. "I think Mom was a lot more complicated than either of us realized," Marcus replied. "I think she knew things about this place, about that tree that she never shared with us. And I think she was counting on us to be brave enough to find out what those things were." Elias looked out at the tree again, seeing it through his son's eyes for the first time in years. What if Marcus was right? What if Sarah had indeed left them something beyond memories and faded letters? What if the tree wasn't a symbol of his inability to let go, but rather a promise that love could transcend even death itself? "If I'm going to do this," Elias said slowly, "if I'm going to cut into that tree, it should be before you leave. Whatever we find, whatever we don't find, we should face it together." Marcus nodded, understanding the weight of the moment. They were standing at the threshold of discovery or disappointment, of revelation or the final destruction of a beautiful illusion. Either way, they would cross it as father and son, united in their love for the woman who had brought them together, and whose memory had shaped them both. "Tomorrow," Elias decided, "after I finish with the Peterson job, we'll see what your mother left us, if anything at all." As if responding to their decision, a gentle breeze stirred the oak's leaves, sending shadows dancing across the kitchen floor like whispered blessings from the past. The Peterson bathroom sink had been more complicated than expected, requiring Elias to crawl under the house through a cramped crawlspace that left his knees screaming and his shirt soaked with sweat. By the time he returned home, the afternoon sun was painting long shadows across the yard, and Marcus was sitting on the front porch with an envelope in his hands. "It came today," Marcus said without preamble, holding up the thick envelope with Stanford University's distinctive red cardinal logo, official acceptance letter, course schedule, dormitory assignment, everything. Elias wiped his hands on his work shirt and settled onto the porch step beside his son. The envelope looked expensive, official, like it belonged to a world far removed from their modest house on Elm Creek Road. He could see Sarah in Marcus's profile as his son stared at the letter, the same mixture of excitement and uncertainty. She'd worn when they'd first talked about buying this property. "When do you need to be there?" Elias asked, though he dreaded the answer. "August 15th. 3 weeks. Marcus folded the letter carefully as if handling something fragile. "Dad, there's something else. They're offering me a position in their graduate research program. Medieval literature, focusing on Celtic mythology and folklore. It's exactly what I've been working toward." Pride swelled in Elias's chest, followed immediately by the familiar ache of loss. Sarah would have been over the moon to see their son, pursuing academic excellence, following his intellectual curiosity wherever it led. She'd always encouraged Marcus's love of stories and legends, reading to him from old books about knights and magic when he was small. "That's incredible, son. You've worked hard for this opportunity." Marcus shifted uncomfortably. The acceptance letter crinkling in his hands. "The thing is, they want me to start immediately if possible. There's a summer orientation program, and Professor Brightwater, she's the department head, thinks I'd benefit from getting acclimated early." "How early?" The question came out sharper than Elias intended. "This weekend. I could drive out Saturday, get settled, maybe start the orientation Monday." Marcus's words came in a rush, as if speed could soften their impact. "I know we talked about doing something with the tree first. But Dad, this is my chance, my one real shot at making something of myself." Elias felt the ground shifting beneath him, the comfortable rhythms of his life suddenly accelerating beyond his control. 3 weeks had seemed manageable, enough time to prepare himself for the inevitable. But 3 days. The house would go from inhabited to empty in the span of a heartbeat. "You're afraid," Marcus said, and his voice carried the same gentle perception Sarah had always possessed. "You're afraid that if I leave now, something will happen to the tree, to Mom's memory, to whatever connection we have left." "I'm afraid," Elias admitted, "that if you leave now, I'll lose my courage, that I'll spend the next 30 years staring at that tree and wondering what might have been inside it, but never finding the strength to look." They sat in silence as the sun continued its descent, painting the oak tree in shades of gold and amber. The mysterious bulge at its base seemed to pulse with its own inner light, as if responding to their conversation with patient understanding. "Then, we do it tonight," Marcus said finally. "Before I lose my nerve, before you lose yours. We go out there with a saw and find out what Mom left us." Elias felt his heart rate accelerate. After 30 years of careful measurement and gentle speculation, the moment of truth felt sudden and overwhelming. What if there's nothing? What if I've been talking to an empty growth for 3 decades? "Then we'll know," Marcus said simply. "And maybe that's enough. Maybe knowing is better than wondering. What if there's something we're not prepared to find? What if your mother—" Elias couldn't finish the thought, couldn't voice his deepest fear that opening the tree might somehow disturb Sarah's rest or destroy the last tangible connection he had to her presence. Marcus stood and extended his hand to his father. "Then we face it together, the way she would have wanted us to." Elias took his son's hand and let himself be pulled to his feet. They walked around the house to the tool shed, where Elias kept his saws and woodworking equipment. His hands shook slightly as he selected a clean handsaw with fine teeth, the kind used for precision work rather than rough cutting. "Not a chainsaw?" Marcus asked. "This deserves respect," Elias said, running his thumb along the saw's edge. "If your mother really did leave us something, I'm not going to destroy it with a power tool." They approached the tree as the last light faded from the sky. The bulge sat at the base of the massive trunk like a wooden egg, its surface smooth and strangely warm to the touch. Elias had touched it countless times over the years, but tonight it felt different, expectant somehow, as if it had been waiting for this moment. "Where do we start?" Marcus asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Elias knelt beside the growth, running his hands over its surface until he found what felt like a natural seam, a place where the wood grains suggested a division. "Here," he said, positioning the saw blade. "If there's an opening, it would be here." The first cut felt like sacrilege. The saw bit into the wood with surprising ease, as if the tree wanted to be opened. Wood shavings fell away in perfect spirals, releasing a scent that reminded Elias powerfully of Sarah's workshop in the basement, where she'd spent countless hours carving small animals and decorative boxes. "Dad," Marcus said suddenly, his voice tight with emotion, "look at the sawdust." Elias paused in his cutting and examined the wood shavings. They were perfectly formed, almost decorative, and they carried a faint shimmer that seemed impossible in natural wood. More strangely, they smelled like the lavender. Sachets Sarah had kept in her dresser drawers. "Keep going," Marcus urged. "There's definitely something inside." Elias resumed cutting, following the natural seam around the bulge's circumference. As the saw blade went deeper, he began to encounter what felt like a different material, something harder and more refined than raw wood. After 20 minutes of careful work, he felt the blade break through into empty space. "It's hollow," he announced, his voice filled with wonder. "There's definitely a cavity inside." Working together, they managed to split the bulge open along the cut line. The two halves fell away like the shells of a wooden egg, revealing a carefully crafted interior, lined with what appeared to be polished cedar, and nestled in the center, wrapped in oiled cloth that looked as fresh as if it had been placed there yesterday, was a collection of objects that made both men gasp. A music box sat at the center of the arrangement, its wooden case carved with intricate Celtic knotwork. Beside it lay a leather-bound journal with Sarah's initials embossed on the cover, and next to that, gleaming in the moonlight, was an ornate silver key attached to a chain. "She really did it," Marcus whispered. "She really left us something." Elias reached for the music box with trembling hands. The moment his fingers touched the carved wood, it began to play, a soft, haunting melody that he recognized as the lullaby Sarah had sung to Marcus when he was small, the same song she'd hummed while working in her basement workshop, the same tune that had filled their house with love and comfort during those precious years when their family was complete. As the melody filled the night air, both men felt tears streaming down their faces. This wasn't just a hidden treasure or a clever surprise. This was proof that love could transcend death, that the bonds between family members were strong enough to bridge the gap between the living and the lost. "How did she know?" Marcus asked, his voice choked with emotion. "How could she have known we'd need this now, 30 years later?" Elias lifted the journal from its resting place, feeling the weight of his wife's thoughts and dreams in his hands. "Because she was your mother," he said simply, "and mothers always know." The silver key caught the moonlight as Elias examined it, its surface engraved with symbols he didn't recognize, but that seemed somehow familiar, as if he'd seen them in dreams or half-remembered stories. Whatever this key unlocked, whatever secrets the journal contained, their lives had just changed forever. The empty house no longer seemed like an ending. It felt like a beginning. Elias hadn't slept at all. The three objects from the tree sat on the kitchen table like artifacts from another world, catching the first light of dawn through the window. The music box had played its lullaby twice more during the night before falling silent, as if it had delivered its message and was now content to wait. The journal remained unopened. Neither man had found the courage to read Sarah's words yet, and the silver key lay beside them both, mysterious and purposeful. Marcus emerged from his childhood bedroom, carrying a duffel bag and looking as sleepless as his father. They'd agreed that he would still leave for Stanford that morning, but now everything felt different. The discovery had created more questions than answers, and the thought of separation felt suddenly urgent rather than natural. "We should read it together," Marcus said, nodding toward the journal. "Before I go." Elias pulled out the worn measuring tape he'd used for 30 years to track the tree's growth. The familiar weight of it in his hands provided comfort, a connection to the methodical patience that had brought them to this moment. First, let's measure what we found. Your mother was precise about everything. If she left us these things, the measurements matter. The music box was exactly 6 inches square and 4 inches high. The journal measured 8 by 10 inches, its leather cover soft with age, but perfectly preserved. The silver key was 3 inches long. Its ornate head worked in a pattern that seemed to shift and change, depending on the angle of view. "Dad," Marcus said softly, examining the measuring tape itself. "Look at this." Elias followed his son's gaze to discover small notches cut into the metal tape at specific intervals, marks he'd never noticed despite decades of use. They were tiny, almost invisible unless you knew to look for them, but they were definitely intentional. "She marked your measuring tape," Marcus continued, running his finger over the small cuts. "Mom knew you'd measure everything. She was counting on it." The realization sent a chill through Elias. Sarah had anticipated his habits, his need for precision and documentation. She'd known he would approach her gift with the same methodical care he brought to everything else in his life. The measuring tape wasn't just a tool, it was part of her message. "The notches correspond to years," Elias said, studying the pattern. "1 mark for every year she expected the tree to grow." He counted carefully, his finger tracing each tiny cut. 30 marks. She knew exactly how long it would take. A knock at the front door interrupted their discovery. Elias opened it to find Mrs. Chen standing on the porch, her usually serene expression clouded with concern. The elderly woman held a covered basket and wore a traditional Chinese jacket despite the summer heat. "I felt the change in the night," she said without preamble, stepping into the house as if she'd been invited. "The tree has given up its secret." Elias and Marcus exchanged glances. Mrs. Chen had lived on Elm Creek Road for as long as they could remember, but she'd always been a private neighbor, offering only cryptic comments about the tree and its significance. "You knew," Marcus said, not really a question. "You knew what was in there." Mrs. Chen set her basket on the kitchen counter and regarded the objects on the table with satisfaction rather than surprise. "Your mother came to me before she died. She was seeking guidance about old ways, traditional methods of preserving what matters most." "What kind of old ways?" Elias asked, feeling the ground shift beneath his understanding once again. "My grandmother was what you might call a wise woman," Mrs. Chen explained, settling into one of the kitchen chairs as if she belonged there. "She taught me about soul vessels, about binding love to living things so it could survive beyond death. When Sarah asked for help, I recognized her desperation and her devotion. The words hung in the air like smoke from an altar candle." Elias had always thought of Mrs. Chen as simply an eccentric neighbor with a beautiful garden. The possibility that she was something more, a keeper of ancient knowledge, a practitioner of traditions older than memory, reframed everything he thought he knew about his quiet street. "You helped her create this," Marcus said, gesturing toward the objects. "I taught her the principles," Mrs. Chen corrected, "but the implementation was entirely her own. Your mother had a gift for working with wood, and she understood instinctively how to weave love into physical matter. What she created was beyond anything I could have imagined." Mrs. Chen opened her basket and withdrew a collection of dried herbs, small stones, and what appeared to be hand-copied pages covered in symbols, similar to those on the silver key. "She asked me to watch over you both, to provide guidance when the time came. That time is now." Elias picked up one of the copied pages, squinting at the unfamiliar characters. "Is this Chinese?" "Some of it, but also Celtic, Norse, and symbols from traditions so old they have no names." Mrs. Chen arranged the herbs in small piles on the table. "Your wife researched extensively before she came to me. She understood that love transcends cultural boundaries, that the deepest magic comes from the heart rather than any particular tradition." Marcus opened the journal carefully, revealing Sarah's familiar handwriting on the first page. But the words weren't in English. They were in the same mixture of symbols and scripts that covered Mrs. Chen's pages. She learned to write in the old ways, Mrs. Chen explained. The journal will reveal its secrets gradually, as you're ready to understand them. But first, you must prepare yourselves. What your mother created requires participation, not just observation. What kind of participation? Elias asked. Though he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer, Mrs. Chen smiled, and for the first time since Sarah's death, Elias felt a warmth that reminded him of his wife's presence. Trust, acceptance, and the willingness to believe that love is stronger than death. These are not difficult requirements for a man who has spoken to a tree for 30 years. She stood and began gathering her materials. I will return tomorrow evening with proper instructions. In the meantime, read what you can in the journal, listen to the music box, and keep the key with you always. Your wife's gift is just beginning to unfold. After Mrs. Chen left, Elias and Marcus sat in stunned silence. The ordinary summer morning had become something else entirely, a threshold between the world they'd known and possibilities they'd never imagined. I should stay, Marcus said suddenly. Stanford can wait. This is more important. Elias shook his head, though the offer tempted him more than he cared to admit. Your mother spent 30 years planning this. She wouldn't want you to delay your education because of it. Besides, he lifted the measuring tape, feeling its familiar weight. If she could plan this precisely, she probably knew exactly when. You'd be leaving too. They embraced then, father and son united by mystery and love, by the growing understanding that Sarah Ward had been far more complex and capable than either of them had ever realized. The measuring tape remained in Elias's hands as Marcus drove away, a tool transformed into a talisman, proof that patience and devotion could be rewarded in ways beyond imagination. With Marcus gone, and the house settling into unfamiliar quiet, Elias found himself drawn to the basement for the first time in years. The wooden steps creaked under his weight as he descended into the space that had once been Sarah's workshop. Dust motes danced in the afternoon light, filtering through small windows, and the air still carried the faint scent of wood shavings and varnish. Her workbench stood exactly as she'd left it 30 years ago, tools arranged with the precision of a surgeon's instruments. Chisels, gouges, and carving knives lay in felt-lined drawers, their edges still sharp despite decades of neglect. A half-finished carving of a sparrow sat on the bench, frozen in mid-flight, waiting for hands that would never return to complete but it was the carved wooden bird on the kitchen windowsill that had drawn him down here, a gift Sarah had given him during her final weeks. Now, examining her tools and understanding the skill required to create such delicate work, Elias realized he'd underestimated his wife's artistry. The bird wasn't just a pretty ornament, it was a masterpiece of miniature sculpture, every feather individually defined, every curve flowing with natural grace. He climbed back upstairs and retrieved the bird from its perch by the window. In the better light of the workshop, he could see details he'd never noticed, tiny symbols carved into the base, so small they were almost invisible. The same symbols that appeared on the silver key and in Mrs. Chen's copied pages. She was preparing for this long before she got sick. Elias murmured to himself, turning the bird over in his hands. The symbols seemed to pulse with their own inner light, or perhaps that was just his imagination running wild after the previous night's revelations. Sarah's journal lay open on the workbench, where he'd brought it to study in better light. The first few pages were written in English, documenting her research into what she called preservation arts. Her handwriting was careful and methodical, the work of someone who understood she was recording something precious. The old ways teach us that love is a form of energy, she had written. It can neither be created nor destroyed, only transformed from one state to another. If I can learn to channel that energy into something lasting, something that will endure beyond my physical presence, then I haven't truly left them at all. The pages that followed traced her journey from desperate wife and mother to student of ancient traditions. She'd found Mrs. Chen through a connection at the local library, a librarian who specialized in folklore and knew about the elderly woman's family history. What began as casual conversation about Asian woodworking techniques had evolved into something far deeper. Mrs. Chen's grandmother was trained in the old country, Sarah had written. She carried knowledge that most people have forgotten. How? To bind intention to matter, how to create objects that serve as bridges between worlds. She was reluctant to teach me at first, afraid that I was motivated by grief rather than understanding. But when I showed her my carvings, when she saw that I already possessed the necessary skills, she agreed to guide me. The wooden bird felt warm in Elias's hands as he read, as if responding to his touch with some kind of inner awareness. He set it carefully on the workbench and continued reading, discovering page after page of meticulous notes about techniques that seemed to blend craftsmanship with something approaching magic. Sarah had spent months learning to carve specific symbols, to select wood based on its spiritual properties rather than just its grain and workability. She'd practiced meditation techniques designed to focus her intentions while working, to infuse each project with purpose and love. The bird had been her first successful attempt at creating what Mrs. Chen called a soul anchor, an object capable of holding and transmitting emotional energy across time. The tree was already ancient when we bought this property, Sarah had written. Mrs. Chen explained that such trees often serve as natural conduits for spiritual energy. If I could create a proper vessel and convince the tree to accept it, I might be able to preserve something essential for Elias and Marcus to find when they were ready. The next several pages detailed her work on the capsule itself, the careful selection of cedar for its preservative properties and oak for its symbolic connection to strength and endurance. She'd carved the interior by hand, working in the basement workshop during the early morning hours, when pain medication kept her alert, but Elias and Marcus were still sleeping. The music box was the most challenging piece, she had written. The mechanism had to be modified to respond to touch rather than winding, and the song, Marcus's lullaby, had to be encoded into the metal in a way that would preserve its emotional resonance. Mrs. Chen introduced me to a clockmaker who understood the old ways, and together we created something that should play for decades without mechanical failure. Elias touched the carved bird again, understanding now that it had been practiced for something far more ambitious. Every tool in Sarah's workshop, every half-finished project, had been preparation for her final masterpiece. She'd transformed herself from hobbyist to artisan to something approaching a folk magician, all in service of love and family. The journal's later pages grew more mystical, documenting rituals and practices that seemed to belong more to fantasy than reality. Sarah described ceremonies performed under specific moon phases, the preparation of oils and herbs designed to enhance spiritual connection, and meditative practices that allowed her to perceive what she called the tree's willingness to participate. "The oak has accepted my proposal," she had written in an entry dated just 2 weeks before her death. "Last night, during the full moon ceremony, I felt its ancient consciousness acknowledge mine. It understands what I'm asking, and it's willing to serve as guardian and protector. The vessel is ready, the contents are prepared, and the binding ritual is scheduled for tomorrow night." The final English entry was brief but profound. "If you're reading this, my beloved husband, then the magic worked exactly as intended. The tree has kept its promise, and you found the courage to look beyond the surface of things. Trust in what comes next. Trust in Mrs. Chen's guidance, and most importantly, trust in the love that brought us together and will never truly separate us." The pages that followed were written in the symbolic script that Mrs. Chen had taught her, unintelligible to Elias but somehow familiar, as if the meaning existed just beyond the edge of his understanding. He closed the journal carefully, overwhelmed by the revelation of his wife's hidden depths and secret preparations. Sarah had died not as a victim of illness, but as a woman who had taken control of her final weeks, who had transformed her approaching death into an opportunity for transcendent love. The carved bird seemed to watch him from its place on the workbench, a small guardian containing more wisdom and devotion than he'd ever imagined possible. Tomorrow evening, Mrs. Chen would return with instructions for the next phase of Sarah's gift. But tonight, Elias would sit with the tools and artifacts of his wife's transformation, marveling at the woman he'd thought he knew completely, but who had surprised him one final time with the depth of her love and the power of her determination. The phone call from Marcus came at 7 in the morning, his voice tight with excitement and confusion. "Dad, you need to see what I found at the university library. Professor Brightwater had me researching Celtic folklore for my orientation project, and I discovered something about our family." Elias cradled the phone against his shoulder while pouring coffee, Sarah's journal open on the kitchen table beside him. He'd spent the night trying to decipher the symbolic script, making small progress with the help of Mrs. Chen's copied pages. What kind of something? Genealogy records, immigration documents, even some transcribed interviews from the 1920s. Dad, Sarah's great-grandmother, wasn't just Irish. She was what they called a bean fiasa, a wise woman who practiced traditional healing and folk magic. There are documented accounts of her work in County Cork before she emigrated. The coffee pot trembled in Elias's hands. How is that possible? Sarah never mentioned anything about family traditions. Maybe she didn't know, or maybe she was protecting us from something she thought we wouldn't understand. But there's more. Marcus's voice dropped to an excited whisper. Professor Brightwater specializes in Celtic traditions that survived the emigration to America. She says there are families throughout New England who maintain the old practices in secret, passing knowledge from mother to daughter for generations. Elias sank into his chair, staring at Sarah's hidden art journal spread before him. The symbols that had seemed so mysterious suddenly felt familiar, as if they were part of a heritage he'd never known he possessed. "Your mother must have discovered this somehow during her research." The interview transcripts mention something called the Seol Dryokta, the magic seed. It was a technique for preserving spiritual essence in living wood, usually oak trees, that were already considered sacred. Dad, what if this isn't just about Mom's love for us? What if she was following a family tradition that goes back hundreds of years? After ending the call, Elias retreated to Sarah's workshop with renewed purpose. He'd discovered a hidden compartment in her workbench the previous night, sealed behind a panel that required precise pressure on 2 carved symbols to open. Inside, he'd found additional journals, older ones, written in different hands, but bearing the same mixture of practical woodworking notes and mystical instructions. The oldest journal was bound in cracked leather and written in what appeared to be Gaelic, with occasional English translations in Sarah's careful handwriting. The first entry she'd translated read, "My grandmother in the old country taught me that trees remember everything, every storm they weather, every season they endure, every human hand that touches them with reverence. A skilled woman can teach a tree to remember love itself, to hold it safe until the time comes for sharing." Page after page revealed a tradition of women who had learned to work with what they called cooperative spirits, the consciousness that ancient trees were believed to possess. They created soul vessels not through force or manipulation, but through patient negotiation with the tree's own wisdom and willingness to help. The oak must choose to participate. Sarah had translated from a particularly complex passage. A woman cannot compel a tree to hold her essence. She can only ask and offer something of value in return. Usually this means caring for the tree throughout her lifetime, speaking to it regularly and ensuring its health and protection. Elias thought about his 30 years of daily conversations with the oak, his careful measurement and monitoring of its health. Had Sarah somehow arranged for him to fulfill the traditional requirements without understanding what he was doing? Had his devotion to the tree been part of her larger plan from the very beginning? Another journal, written in a more recent hand, contained what appeared to be Sarah's mother's notes about their family heritage. "My daughter shows no interest in the old ways," she had written. "She prefers her books and her art to the traditions that kept our family strong through centuries of hardship. Perhaps it's better this way. The modern world has little patience for women who speak to trees and work with their hands to create meaning from wood and stone." But Sarah had been interested, Elias realized. She'd simply hidden that interest so well that even her own mother hadn't recognized it. The basement workshop, her love of carving, her intuitive understanding of wood and its properties, all of it had been preparation for the moment when she would need to draw upon her ancestral knowledge to preserve what mattered most. He found sketch after sketch of the oak tree in her journals, drawn from every angle and in every season. She documented its growth patterns, the texture of its bark, the way sunlight filtered through its leaves at different times of day. But more than mere observation, these drawings showed a developing relationship between artist and subject, a growing understanding of the tree's personality and preferences. "The oak is ancient beyond my ability to measure," she had written. "It has weathered storms that would have destroyed lesser trees, and it carries wisdom that comes only from centuries of patient endurance. When I approach it with proper respect and genuine need, I can feel its willingness to help. It understands suffering and loss because it has experienced both many times. It also understands love that transcends individual lifetimes." The final journal in the hidden compartment was entirely in Sarah's hand, written during the last months of her life. These pages were different from her earlier research notes, more personal, more urgent, filled with the desperate love of a mother who knew she was running out of time. "Elias doesn't believe in magic, and I've never given him reason to," she had written. "He sees my woodworking as a pleasant hobby, my conversations with the tree as harmless eccentricity. But if I do this correctly, if I can channel everything I've learned from the family journals and Mrs. Chen's teaching, I can leave them something that will help them understand the true depth of love's power." Page after page detailed her preparations, the careful selection of materials, the timing of rituals according to moon phases and seasonal changes. She'd worked with scientific precision to create something that transcended science, using traditional techniques refined over generations to achieve a goal that most people would consider impossible. "The blessing stone was my grandmother's," she had written in one of the final entries. "I found it in my mother's jewelry box after she died, wrapped in silk and accompanied by a note I couldn't read until Mrs. Chen taught me the old script. It carries the accumulated blessings of 7 generations of women who used their hands and hearts to preserve love beyond death. Tonight, I add my own blessing to its power." Elias set down the journal and climbed the stairs to search through Sarah's jewelry box, something he'd avoided touching since her death. Buried beneath costume jewelry and forgotten earrings, he found a small stone wrapped in faded silk. The moment his fingers touched it, he felt a warmth that seemed to come from within the stone itself, and he understood that he was holding something far older and more significant than he'd ever imagined. The stone was carved with the same symbols that appeared throughout Sarah's journals, but these markings were worn smooth by countless hands that had held it before his. 7 generations of women, Marcus had said. 7 generations of mothers and daughters who had preserved love through knowledge, skill, and unwavering faith in the power of connection that transcends death. Sarah hadn't just created a beautiful surprise hidden in a tree, she'd fulfilled A family destiny that stretched back through centuries of tradition, using gifts passed down through generations to ensure that love could survive even the ultimate separation. Dr. Eleanor Brightwater arrived at Elm Creek Road in a vintage Volvo loaded with academic texts and looking every inch the university professor. She was younger than Elias had expected from Marcus's description, perhaps 50, with prematurely silver hair and the kind of intense curiosity that suggested a lifetime spent chasing knowledge into unusual corners. "Your son has caused quite a stir in our department," she said by way of introduction, accepting Elias's offer of coffee and settling at the kitchen table where Sarah's artifacts lay arranged like museum pieces. "In 30 years of studying Celtic folklore, I've never encountered such a complete documentation of traditional practices surviving in an American family." Mrs. Chen had arrived an hour earlier, bringing more herbs and what she called proper ceremonial implements. Small bells, polished stones, and a collection of candles made from beeswax and aromatic herbs. The elderly woman moved around the kitchen with quiet efficiency, preparing what she described as a suitable environment for understanding. "The blessing stone alone is extraordinary," Dr. Brightwater continued, examining the carved stone with obvious reverence. "These symbols represent a form of Ogham script that predates most written Celtic languages. Your wife's family carried knowledge that academic circles assumed had been lost forever." Elias felt overwhelmed by the convergence of scholarly expertise and mystical tradition in his humble kitchen. 2 days ago, his biggest concern had been fixing the Petersons' bathroom sink. Now he was hosting what appeared to be a consultation between a university professor and a practitioner of folk magic, all centered around artifacts his wife had hidden in a tree. "Mrs. Chen tells me that Sarah approached her for guidance," Dr. Brightwater said. "That suggests she discovered her heritage through research rather than family transmission. Do you know what triggered that discovery?" "Marcus found genealogy records at Stanford," Elias replied. "But I think Sarah knew something was different about her family long before she got sick. She always had an intuitive understanding of wood, of how to work with it in ways that seemed almost supernatural." Mrs. Chen nodded approvingly. "Gift often manifests before knowledge. Your wife possessed the hands of a traditional craftswoman and the heart of someone called to preserve what matters most. When she came to me, desperate to find a way to remain present for her family after death, I recognized both the gift and the calling." Dr. Brightwater opened one of her texts to a page filled with photographs of carved stones and wooden artifacts. "What your wife accomplished represents a nearly perfect synthesis of Celtic soul vessel traditions and Asian energy-binding techniques. The theoretical framework alone should have taken years to master, but she managed it in months. Love provides its own acceleration," Mrs. Chen said simply. "When someone is motivated by absolute devotion rather than mere curiosity, learning happens at extraordinary speed." Elias picked up the silver key, still warm despite the cool morning air. "This key, what does it unlock? Sarah's journal mentions it, but not specifically." Dr. Brightwater examined the key with obvious fascination. "The craftsmanship is exceptional. Hand-forged silver worked with symbols that combine Celtic binding knots with what appear to be Chinese characters for protection and eternal connection. But as for what it unlocks," she looked at Mrs. Chen expectantly. "That depends on your willingness to trust what cannot be proven," Mrs. Chen replied. "Your wife created a series of connected vessels, each designed to reveal its secrets when you're emotionally prepared to receive them. The key opens not a physical lock, but barriers within your own understanding." Dr. Brightwater leaned forward, her academic excitement barely contained. "In traditional Celtic practice, keys like this were used in what scholars call graduated revelation, a process where magical knowledge unfolds gradually to prevent overwhelming the recipient. Your wife understood that discovering everything at once might be too much for you and Marcus to process." So, there are more hidden things? Elias asked, though part of him already knew the answer. Mrs. Chen smiled mysteriously. Your wife was thorough in her planning. The tree vessel was only the beginning, a way to prove that love could transcend death and prepare you for deeper mysteries. But first, you must demonstrate your commitment to understanding rather than simply collecting magical objects. What kind of commitment? Elias's voice carried a mixture of eagerness and apprehension. The key will guide you, Dr. Brightwater explained, consulting her notes. In Celtic tradition, keys like this grow warm when pointed toward objects or locations that contain related magic. Your wife essentially created a treasure hunt designed to teach you about your shared heritage while revealing her gifts gradually. Elias stood and walked around the kitchen, holding the key and paying attention to its temperature. Near the basement door, it grew noticeably warmer. She hid something else in her workshop. Or the workshop itself is significant, Mrs. Chen suggested. Traditional craftswomen often consecrated their workspaces, turning them into focal points. For spiritual energy, they descended to the basement together, the key growing warmer with each step. In Sarah's workshop, it became almost hot to the touch near a section of wall that Elias had always assumed was solid. Dr. Brightwater ran her hands over the wooden paneling, pressing and probing until she found a section that gave slightly under pressure. Here, she said, there's a hidden panel. Working together, they discovered a concealed compartment behind Sarah's tool rack. Inside, wrapped in the same oiled cloth that had protected the tree vessel, they found another collection of objects. A second, smaller music box, a set of wooden tablets covered in carved symbols, and a small glass vial filled with what appeared to be tree sap that glowed with its own inner light. Phase 2, Mrs. Chen said with satisfaction. Your wife's education program continues. The second music box played a different melody when Elias touched it, not the lullaby from the tree vessel, but a complex piece that seemed to combine multiple traditional songs. Dr. Brightwater recognized elements of Irish folk tunes woven together with what sounded like Chinese ceremonial music. She's teaching you about synthesis, the professor explained, how different traditions can be combined to create something stronger than either could achieve alone. This melody represents the merging of her Celtic heritage with Mrs. Chen's Asian wisdom. The wooden tablets were covered in symbols that Elias now recognized as the same script from Sarah's advanced journals. But these carvings were more elaborate, more detailed, suggesting instructions rather than simple documentation. These are lesson tablets, Mrs. Chen said, running her fingers over the carved symbols. Traditional teaching tools used to pass complex knowledge from master to student. Your wife created a course of study designed specifically for you and Marcus. The glowing tree sap was perhaps the most mysterious discovery. The vial felt warm in Elias's hands, and the liquid inside seemed to pulse with its own heartbeat. Dr. Brightwater had never seen anything like it, but Mrs. Chen nodded as if she'd been expecting it. Essence of the original bonding, she explained. Sap collected from the oak during the ritual that created the tree vessel. This represents the actual moment when your wife's love became part of the tree's living structure. What am I supposed to do with it? Elias asked. That will become clear as you study the lesson tablets, Mrs. Chen replied. But first, you must call Marcus. This phase of your wife's gift requires both father and son to participate. As they climbed back to the kitchen, Elias felt the weight of revelation settling around him like a mantle. Sarah hadn't just left them a beautiful surprise. She'd created an entire curriculum designed to transform their understanding of love, family, and the connections that bind people together across time and space. The silver key had revealed her secret, but Elias suspected it would unlock many more before Sarah's gift was fully revealed. His wife had died 30 years ago, but her teaching had only just begun. Dr. Brightwater gathered her books with obvious reluctance. I'll return tomorrow with more research materials. What your wife accomplished here deserves proper documentation. And your family's story could revolutionize academic understanding of how traditional practices survived immigration and modernization. After the professor left, Mrs. Chen began packing her ceremonial supplies with the same quiet efficiency she'd shown in arranging them. "Call your son tonight," she advised. "Tell him to return this weekend if possible. The next phase requires both of you, and it cannot wait much longer." "Why not?" Elias asked. Mrs. Chen paused at the door, her expression serious. "Because your wife's essence is still bound to the tree, and that binding requires regular renewal through the participation of those she died to protect. If you wait too long between phases, the connection weakens. Love transcends death, but it needs living hearts to give it strength." Elias stood in his kitchen, surrounded by impossible artifacts and the lingering scent of ceremonial herbs, understanding that his quiet life had been permanently transformed. Sarah's love had indeed transcended death, but accepting that gift meant embracing a world far stranger and more wonderful than he'd ever imagined possible. Marcus arrived Friday evening, his academic excitement palpable as he burst through the front door carrying a laptop bag and a box of photocopied documents. "Dad, you won't believe what Professor Brightwater and I discovered. Our family history goes back further than we thought, and there's something about the property, something Sarah knew that she never told us." Elias had spent the week studying the lesson tablets with Mrs. Chen's guidance, slowly learning to read the symbolic script that Sarah had mastered in her final months. The process was meditative, almost hypnotic, and he'd begun to understand why traditional knowledge was preserved in this format. The symbols didn't just convey information, they required contemplation, forcing the reader to internalize concepts rather than simply memorize facts. "The land records go back to 1847, Marcus continued, spreading documents across the kitchen table. "This property was originally part of a 200-acre tract purchased by Irish immigrants, including Sarah's great-great-grandmother, Bridget O'Sullivan. But here's the incredible part. They didn't buy this land randomly. They were following instructions." Marcus pulled out a photocopied letter written in faded ink, the paper yellowed with age. "This is from Bridget to her sister back in County Cork, dated 1848. Listen to this. We have found the place the tree spirits told us to seek. The great oak stands exactly as described in grandmother's visions, and the land beneath it hums with the old power. The journey was difficult, but we have arrived where we were meant to be." Elias felt his understanding of their family history shift once again. "They came here specifically because of the tree, not just because of it, because they were called to it." Marcus opened his laptop and showed his father a digitized map of the original land grants. "Look at the survey markers. The original property lines were drawn to center on the oak tree. These weren't random settlers, they were carrying out a specific mission." Dr. Brightwater had provided additional context from her research into Celtic emigration patterns. Certain families, particularly those who maintained traditional practices, had been guided by what they called spirit dreams to specific locations in the New World. These weren't random resettlements, but carefully planned relocations designed to preserve and continue ancient traditions in places where the old magic could take root. "The tree was already sacred when they arrived," Marcus explained, showing his father photographs of similar trees in Ireland and Scotland. These massive oaks were considered dwelling places for spirits, natural focal points for what Celtic traditions called thin places, locations where the barrier between physical and spiritual worlds was permeable. Mrs. Chen, who had been listening quietly from her chair by the window, nodded approvingly. "Your wife understood this instinctively. When she chose this property, she wasn't just buying a house. She was returning to a place that had been prepared for her family across generations." Elias thought about the day he and Sarah had first seen the property, how she'd insisted they buy it despite the financial stretch it represented. She'd stood beneath the oak tree for nearly an hour, her hands pressed against its bark, claiming. She could feel its history in ways that had seemed poetic, but not literally true. "There's more," Marcus said, pulling out a manila folder marked with official government seals. "Professor Brightwater has connections with the National Archives. She requested the complete file on this property, including documents that are usually restricted." The folder contained geological surveys, Native American treaty documents, and historical assessments that painted a picture of the land extending far beyond European settlement. The oak tree had been sacred to local tribes for centuries before. Irish immigrants arrived, considered a guardian tree that protected the surrounding area from harmful spirits. The tribal records call it Grandfather Oak, Marcus read from a translated document. They believed it held the accumulated wisdom of every generation that had lived under its protection. When the Irish families arrived and explained their own traditions around sacred trees, the tribal elders saw it as confirmation that the tree's power transcended cultural boundaries. A treaty signed in 1846 had formally transferred guardianship of the tree from tribal shamans to the Irish families, with the understanding that both groups would continue to honor its spiritual significance. The document was witnessed by representatives from 3 tribes and signed with symbols that Elias now recognized as similar to those in Sarah's lesson tablets. "Your wife didn't discover this history," Mrs. Chen said quietly. "She was born knowing it, carrying the memory in her bones, the way traditional knowledge is always preserved. When she got sick and realized she might not live to pass that knowledge to Marcus directly, she found other ways to ensure the continuation of her family's sacred responsibility. The implications were staggering. Sarah hadn't just hidden artifacts. In a tree, she'd fulfilled a hereditary obligation that stretched back through generations of women who had served as guardians of ancient wisdom. The tree vessel, the lesson tablets, the continuing education program she'd designed, all of it was part of a tradition that predated written history. "But there's something else," Marcus said, his voice dropping to an excited whisper. "Something that changes everything we thought we knew about Mom's death." He pulled out a medical file that Dr. Brightwater had somehow obtained through her academic connections. Sarah's hospital records, treatment notes, and autopsy report, documents that Elias had never seen because he'd been too devastated to request them. "Dad, look at the timeline. Mum's cancer was diagnosed in February, but according to these records, her symptoms began the previous October. She knew she was sick for months before she told us." Elias felt the room spin around him. "That's impossible. She would have told me." "Not if she was using that time to prepare," Mrs. Chen said gently. "Traditional women often hide illness until their spiritual preparations are complete. Your wife spent those months learning everything she needed to know, creating everything she needed to create, ensuring that her death would serve a purpose greater than simple loss." The medical records showed a pattern of missed appointments, delayed treatments, and what the doctors had noted as patient non-compliance with recommended therapies. But viewed through the lens of Sarah's secret activities, those delays took on different meaning. She'd been managing her illness to buy time for her real work, the preservation of love and tradition through methods that modern medicine couldn't understand or appreciate. "She could have lived longer," Marcus said, tears streaming down his face, "if she'd started treatment when the symptoms first appeared. If she'd been honest about her condition, she might have had years instead of months. She chose how to use the time she had," Mrs. Chen replied firmly. "Your wife understood that some things are more important than extending individual life, like ensuring that love and knowledge continue beyond death. She made a conscious decision to sacrifice quantity of time for quality of purpose." Elias sank into his chair, overwhelmed by the revelation of Sarah's sacrifice. She hadn't just died of cancer, she'd chosen to let cancer take her life while she used her remaining time to create something eternal. The woman he'd mourned as a victim of cruel fate had actually been a hero, making the ultimate sacrifice for love. In the folder's final section, Marcus found Sarah's own documentation of her decision. A letter addressed to both of them, sealed and dated just 1 week before her death. My beloved husband and son, if you're reading this, then you've discovered the full scope of what I tried to accomplish in my final months. I want you to understand that every choice I made was motivated by love, not despair. I could have fought the cancer more aggressively, could have bought myself additional time in this world. But I realized that my family needed something more valuable than a few extra years with a sick woman. They needed proof that love transcends death and knowledge that could guide them through all the challenges yet to come. I am not dying. I'm transforming, becoming something that can continue to love and protect you long after my physical body fails. The tree holds my essence, the artifacts carry my voice, and the traditions I've preserved will ensure that our family's sacred responsibilities continue through Marcus and his children and their children after them. Do not mourn my choice. Celebrate it, and trust that everything I've created for you was designed with perfect love and absolute faith in your ability to carry forward something beautiful and eternal. The kitchen fell silent, except for the sound of two men weeping for a woman whose depth of love and courage they were only beginning to understand. Sarah Ward hadn't just died 30 years ago. She'd transformed herself into something that could love them forever. The weekend stretched before them like an open door to the impossible. Sarah's final letter had included detailed instructions for what she called the completion ritual, a ceremony designed to fully activate the spiritual connection she'd established through the tree vessel. But the letter also contained warnings about the responsibility such knowledge would bring. Once you accept the full truth of what I've created, she had written, you become guardians not just of our families, traditions, but of something much larger. The oak tree and this land represent a focal point for spiritual energy that has been carefully maintained for generations. That maintenance will now fall to you and Marcus, and eventually to his children. Mrs. Chen had arrived Saturday morning, with additional ceremonial supplies and a gravity that Elias hadn't seen before. She moved through the house and yard with the purposefulness of someone preparing for a significant spiritual event, checking the placement of candles, examining the phase of the moon, and testing what she called the energy currents around the oak tree. Your wife chose the timing precisely, she explained to Elias and Marcus as they helped arrange stones in a circle around the tree's base. The full moon, the anniversary of her binding ritual, and your emotional readiness have aligned exactly as she predicted. Tonight, the barrier between her transformed essence and your conscious awareness will be at its thinnest. Dr. Brightwater had returned with 2 colleagues from the university's anthropology department, but Mrs. Chen had gently but firmly sent them away. This is not academic research, she had told the professors. This is a family receiving its inheritance. Observers would disrupt the spiritual dynamics that make such communication possible. Throughout the day, Elias found himself studying the lesson tablets with new urgency. The symbolic script was beginning to make sense, revealing layer after layer of meaning that seemed to unfold directly into his understanding, rather than through normal reading comprehension. Sarah had designed these teaching tools specifically for his way of learning, accounting for his methodical nature and his need to understand the practical applications of abstract concepts. The key serves multiple purposes, one tablet explained, in symbols that now translated themselves almost automatically in his mind. Physical unlocking of hidden vessels, spiritual opening of closed channels, and emotional access to memories that transcend individual experience. When properly used in conjunction with the tree essence and ceremonial music, it creates a bridge between the transformed soul and living consciousness. Marcus had been working with the second music box, discovering that its complex melody contained what appeared to be instructions encoded in musical phrases. Different sections of the song seemed to correspond to different phases of the completion ritual, providing auditory cues for timing and emotional preparation. It's like she created a symphony that teaches you how to communicate with her spirit, Marcus said, his voice filled with wonder. Each movement builds on the previous one, gradually opening your awareness to possibilities you never imagined. As afternoon faded to evening, Mrs. Chen began the preliminary preparations for what she described as the most important spiritual work of her lifetime. She dressed in traditional Chinese ceremonial robes and unpacked instruments Elias had never seen, singing bowls, carved wooden clappers, and small drums that seemed to resonate with heartbeat rhythms. "Your wife studied under my guidance for months," Mrs. Chen explained, as she arranged the ceremonial items around the tree. "But what she accomplished transcended anything I had taught her." She combined Celtic soul-binding traditions with Asian energy work and added innovations that came from her own spiritual insights. Tonight, we will experience the full flowering of her genius. The glowing tree sap had been prepared according to Sarah's instructions, mixed with specific herbs and blessed water to create what the lesson tablets called the communion mixture. 3 drops on the tongue would supposedly allow direct spiritual contact with Sarah's preserved essence, opening channels of communication that existed beyond normal sensory perception. "Are we ready for this?" Elias asked as the sun set, and Mrs. Chen began lighting candles around the tree. "I mean, really ready to discover that my wife has been watching us for 30 years. That magic is real, that everything I thought I knew about life and death was incomplete." Marcus placed a hand on his father's shoulder. "We've been preparing for this our entire lives, Dad. Every conversation you had with the tree, every time you read Mom's letters, every moment you chose love over bitterness, it was all leading to this." Mrs. Chen began the ceremony as the full moon cleared the horizon, her voice rising in what sounded like ancient Chinese chants mixed with Irish traditional songs. The combination should have felt discordant, but instead it created harmonies that seemed to resonate with the earth itself. The oak tree responded to the ceremony in ways that defied natural explanation. Its leaves rustled without wind, its massive trunk seemed to pulse with its own inner light, and the air around it grew thick with presence, not threatening, but unmistakably aware and benevolent. "Place your hands on the tree," Mrs. Chen instructed. "Both of you together feel for the heartbeat that Sarah built into its spiritual structure." Elias and Marcus pressed their palms against the oak's bark and immediately felt what could only be described as a pulse, slow, steady, and utterly familiar. It was Sarah's heartbeat, somehow preserved and amplified through 30 years of a careful spiritual cultivation. "She's here," Marcus whispered, tears streaming down his face. "She's really here." The silver key grew warm in Elias's pocket, and he understood that the moment had come for its final use. Following instructions from the lesson tablets, he pressed the key against a specific pattern of bark near the tree's base. The symbols carved into the key's head began to glow with the same inner light as the tree sap, and suddenly the air filled with Sarah's voice, not audible words, but communication that bypassed hearing entirely, thoughts and emotions and memories flowing directly from her preserved consciousness into theirs. She spoke of her love for them, her pride in how they'd grown and changed, her continued presence during all the moments they'd thought they were alone. "I never left," her voice seemed to say without sound. "I simply learned to love you in a different way." The tree sap, when consumed according to the ritual instructions, intensified the connection until Elias could see Sarah as clearly as he had in life. Not a ghostly apparition, but a vibrant presence made of light and love, smiling at him with the same warmth that had sustained him through 30 years of missing her. "You preserved our love perfectly," she told him. her hands somehow touching. His face despite her lack of physical form. "You talked to me every day. You read my letters with the same devotion I put into writing them. You raised our son to be exactly the man I hoped he would become." Marcus was experiencing his own communion with his mother, receiving memories that he'd been too young to form when she died, being sung to sleep, being read stories, being loved with the fierce protectiveness that only mothers can provide. She filled in the gaps that her early death had left in his childhood, giving him a complete understanding of her love and pride. "The traditions must continue," Sarah explained to both of them, "through the spiritual connection. Marcus will carry our family's knowledge forward, but first he must complete his education and find a partner who can help him understand the full scope of what we've preserved. The tree will guide him to the right person when the time comes, and you, my beloved husband," she said to Elias with infinite tenderness, "must learn to live again. I bound my essence to this place not to trap you here, but to free you to explore the rest of your life knowing that our love remains constant and eternal. I will always be part of this tree, but you must be part of the wider world." The ceremony continued through the night, with Sarah sharing knowledge about their family's spiritual heritage, practical guidance for maintaining the sacred site, and personal messages of love that had accumulated over 30 years of patient waiting. She revealed the locations of additional hidden artifacts, explained the symbolic meanings behind everyday objects that had seemed merely sentimental, and provided instructions for teaching future generations about their responsibilities as guardians of ancient wisdom. As dawn approached, the intensity of the spiritual connection began to fade, but not before Sarah delivered her final gift, the promise that they could return to the tree whenever they needed guidance or simply wanted to feel her presence. The communion ritual could be repeated annually on the anniversary of her transformation, ensuring that their connection would continue throughout their lifetimes. "This is not goodbye," she assured them, as her presence gradually receded into the tree's living consciousness. "This is the beginning of a new kind of relationship, one that death cannot touch and time cannot weaken." Elias and Marcus collapsed against the tree's massive trunk as the ceremony concluded, exhausted but transformed by the experience. They had entered the night as a father and son haunted by loss. They emerged as guardians of something eternal, blessed with the certain knowledge that love could indeed transcend death. Mrs. Chen packed her ceremonial supplies with quiet satisfaction, her work finally complete after 30 years of patient preparation. "Your wife chose well," she told Elias as the sun painted the sky with colors that seemed more vivid than usual. "She chose love over fear, transformation over surrender, eternity over mere time. You and Marcus are now the living witnesses to what such choices can accomplish." The oak tree stood unchanged in the morning light, but everything else had been forever altered. Sarah Ward had kept her final promise, proving that a mother's love could survive even death itself and continue nurturing her family across the boundaries of time and space. The wooden music box sat in the center of the communion circle as the final phase of Sarah's ceremony began, its carved Celtic knotwork gleaming in the moonlight. Throughout the night, it had remained silent despite Elias and Marcus's spiritual connection with Sarah's essence. Now, as Mrs. Chen completed the closing rituals and the tree's spiritual energy reached its peak, the music box began to emit a soft, warm glow. "She's ready to give you the final gift," Mrs. Chen whispered, her voice hoarse from hours of ceremonial chanting. "The music box contains more than melody. It holds her voice, her laughter, her lullabies. Everything you thought was lost forever." Elias approached the music box with trembling hands, understanding that this moment represented the culmination of 30 years of grief and hope. Sarah had promised him proof that love transcends death, And now that proof sat before him in the form of a carved wooden treasure that pulsed with life and memory. The moment his fingers touched the music box's lid, it opened automatically, revealing an interior that seemed far larger than the external dimensions should have allowed. Miniature carved figures moved within like living beings. A tiny Elias working at his tools, a small Marcus growing from child to man, and at the center, a perfect representation of Sarah herself, her arms outstretched, as if embracing them both. But it was the music that made both men weep with recognition and joy, not just the familiar lullaby they'd heard before, but a symphony of sounds that brought Sarah completely back to life in their memories, her voice singing Marcus to sleep as a baby, her laughter echoing through the house during happier times, her gentle humming while she worked in her basement workshop. "My darling boys," Sarah's voice spoke clearly from the music box, as fresh and present as if she were standing beside them. "If you can hear this, then you've completed the journey I set for you. You've discovered who you really are, who I really was, and what our love can accomplish when we refuse to let death have the final word." Marcus collapsed to his knees beside the tree, overcome by hearing his mother's voice with perfect clarity for the first time since childhood. These weren't just echoes or spiritual impressions. This was Sarah herself, speaking directly to them through the magical preservation of her essence. "I recorded these messages during my final weeks," her voice continued, "using techniques Mrs. Jen taught me for binding consciousness to physical objects. Every important thing I wanted to tell you, every piece of guidance you might need, every expression of love that I couldn't bear to leave unsaid. It's all here, preserved forever in the music box." The carved figures within the box began to move more purposefully, acting out scenes from their family life with startling accuracy. Elias watched himself reading bedtime stories to Marcus, saw Sarah teaching their son to identify different types of wood by touch, witnessed private moments of tenderness that he'd forgotten but that Sarah had somehow captured and preserved. "For you, Marcus," Sarah's voice spoke as the tiny carved figure of their son grew and changed before their eyes. "I want you to know that every day of your life has filled me with pride. You carry your father's strength and integrity, but you also possess a curiosity about the world that will serve you well in your academic career. Trust that curiosity. It will lead you to discoveries that benefit not just our family, but the wider preservation of traditional knowledge." The music box showed Marcus studying at Stanford, meeting a young woman whose hands bore the same craftsman's calluses that marked Sarah's family line, building a life that honored both scholarship and spiritual tradition. The visions were so vivid and detailed that they seemed like prophecies rather than mere hopes. "And for you, my beloved Elias," Sarah's voice grew tender as the tiny carved figure of her husband began to move through scenes they'd never lived. Together, traveling to places they'd dreamed of visiting, meeting new people, experiencing joy and adventure that his grief had prevented him from imagining. "I need you to understand that loving me doesn't require staying frozen in the past. I want you to live fully, to explore the world, to open your heart to new possibilities." The music box revealed futures that could still come to pass. Elias, visiting Marcus at university, taking the long-delayed trip to Ireland to explore Sarah's ancestral homeland, perhaps even finding companionship with someone who could appreciate both his loyalty to Sarah's memory and his capacity for continued growth. "The tree will always be here when you need to feel my presence," Sarah's voice assured them both. "But it was never meant to be a prison that kept you from living. It's a sanctuary that can restore your strength and remind you of love's eternal nature, so you can venture forth with confidence and return with stories to share." As the music box's song reached its crescendo, the tiny carved figures joined hands around the miniature tree at the center, creating a tableau of eternal connection that somehow included not just their immediate family, but generations past and future, all united by the love that Sarah had sacrificed everything to preserve. The wooden music box had delivered exactly what Sarah promised: proof that love could survive death, guidance for the future, and the certain knowledge that some bonds truly are eternal. As the music box's melody faded, a second compartment opened within its base, revealing what appeared to be a leather-bound journal no larger than a playing card. But when Elias lifted it from its resting place, the journal expanded in his hands, until it reached normal size, another impossible feat that he was beginning to accept as simply part of Sarah's magical legacy. "The soul journal," Mrs. Chen breathed, recognizing something she had only heard described in legends. "Your wife accomplished what most traditional practitioners only dream of, a living document that serves as a permanent bridge between transformed consciousness and the physical world." The journal's pages were blank when Elias first opened it, but as he watched, Sarah's familiar handwriting began to appear, forming words and sentences in real time as if she were sitting beside them with pen in hand. "My darling family." The journal wrote itself, "This is my gift of continued presence. Whenever you need guidance, comfort, or simply want to share your thoughts with me, write in this journal and I will respond. Death has not silenced me. It has simply changed the way we communicate." Marcus reached out tentatively to touch the self-writing pages, gasping as the words shifted to address him directly. "Marcus, my brilliant son, I can see your wonder and your questions. Yes, this is really me, preserved through love and magic and 30 years of patient preparation. Ask me anything about our family history, about the traditions you'll carry forward, about the life decisions you'll face. I am here to help guide you through all of it." Elias took the pen that materialized beside the journal and wrote with shaking hands, "Sarah, is it really you? Is this real, or are we hallucinating from grief and exhaustion?" The response appeared immediately in her distinctive handwriting. "It's me, beloved. More me than I've been able to be since the night I died. This journal allows my consciousness to flow freely, to respond to your thoughts and emotions with the clarity I possessed in life. I have watched over you both for 30 years, celebrating your victories and aching during your struggles. Now, finally, we can share those experiences together." Marcus wrote his own question. "Mom, why didn't you tell us about our family's magical heritage? Why keep it secret?" "Because you needed to discover it gradually," the journal replied. "Magic revealed too quickly can overwhelm and frighten. I needed you both to develop the wisdom and emotional maturity to handle such responsibility. Your father's 30 years of faithful devotion to the tree proved his readiness. Your academic pursuit of Celtic folklore proved yours. Everything unfolded exactly as it needed to." Over the following hour, the journal became a three-way conversation that bridged the gap between life and death with startling intimacy. Sarah shared memories that Elias had forgotten, answered questions about Marcus's childhood that had puzzled him for years, and provided insights into their family's spiritual heritage that would take years to fully understand. "Tell me about the choice you made," Elias wrote, his hand trembling as he formed the words, "about sacrificing treatment time to create all this. Do you regret it?" "Never," the journal responded emphatically. "Elias, my love, I could have fought the cancer more aggressively, and perhaps lived 2 or 3 additional years as a sick woman growing weaker each day. Instead, I chose to spend my remaining strength creating something that would allow me to love you forever. Would you rather have had those few extra years, or this eternal connection?" The question hung in the air between them, and Elias realized that as much as he had mourned Sarah's death, he would not trade what they had discovered for anything, not even the chance to have her back in physical form. Marcus wrote next, "What do I need to do now? How do I carry this forward?" "Live your life fully," the journal replied. "Complete your education, find love, start a family of your own. When you have children, teach them about their heritage gradually, just as you learned it. The tree will guide you to a partner who shares our family's spiritual gifts. Trust in that guidance and visit home regularly, not out of obligation but out of love. And you, my faithful husband, the journal addressed Elias without him needing to write, must learn to see this discovery as freedom rather than additional responsibility. I am no longer trapped by death, and you are no longer trapped by grief. We have proven that love survives everything. Now live as if you believe it. The journal continued writing, sharing practical guidance about maintaining the tree's spiritual health, instructions for annual communion rituals, and detailed explanations of the family traditions that Marcus would eventually pass to his own children. But more than information, it provided what both men had needed most: the absolute certainty that death was not an ending, but a transformation, and that love truly could transcend any boundary. As dawn light began to filter through the oaks leaves, the journal delivered its final message. This is not goodbye. This is the beginning of a new chapter in our love story. I will be here whenever you need me, ready to share in your joys and comfort you through sorrows. We are still a family, bound not by physical presence, but by something far stronger, love that has been tested by death and emerged victorious. The pages of the journal remained open, waiting for future conversations, future questions, future moments when father and son would need the guidance and comfort that only Sarah could provide. The Soul Journal had revealed its purpose, not just as a record of the past, but as a living connection that would sustain their family bonds across all the years to come. 6 months later, Elias stood in the same kitchen window where this story began, but everything had changed. The morning coffee was still part of his routine, but now he shared it with Sarah through the Soul Journal, writing brief updates about his day and receiving her gentle responses filled with love and encouragement. The yellowed letters tied with blue ribbon remained on the table, but they were no longer his only connection to his wife's continuing presence. Marcus had returned for Christmas break, bringing with him stories of academic success and, more importantly, news of a young woman named Eleanor, who taught traditional crafts in the university's continuing education program. "She works with wood the way you and Mom did," he'd written in the Soul Journal during one of their three-way conversations. "Her hands know things that can't be taught in textbooks." Sarah's response had been immediate and delighted. "Bring her home for Easter. I have things to teach her, traditions to share, and a family heritage that needs another pair of skilled hands to help preserve it." The seed, Sarah's final gift, sat in a place of honor on the kitchen table, waiting for the right moment to be planted. It had come with specific instructions written in the Soul Journal. "When Marcus brings Elena home, plant this seed together in the front yard. It will grow into a companion tree for our oak, one that will anchor your son's branch of the family to this sacred ground, while allowing him to build his own life wherever his path may lead." Elias had followed Sarah's guidance about living more fully, taking his first vacation in 30 years to visit Ireland and explore the landscape his wife's ancestors had called home. The trip had been revelatory, connecting him to centuries of tradition, while opening his eyes to possibilities beyond the familiar routines of Elm Creek Road. In County Cork, he'd found the cottage where Sarah's great-great-grandmother had learned the ancient crafts she'd brought to America. The current owner, a woman who introduced herself as a distant cousin, had known about the family's emigration to the New World and the sacred responsibility they'd carried with them. "We've been wondering about our American relatives for generations," she told Elias over tea in a kitchen that looked remarkably similar to his own. "My grandmother always said that someday someone would return to learn about their heritage and share what they'd preserved across the ocean." The visit had resulted in an ongoing correspondence and plans for hosting Marcus and Elena the following summer, creating connections that bridged continents and generations. Sarah had been right, as always, letting go of fear and embracing Possibility had opened doors he'd never imagined existed. Mrs. Chen still visited regularly, but their relationship had evolved from teacher and student to something approaching equals. Elias had proven his ability to maintain the tree's spiritual health and continue the traditions Sarah had died to preserve. The elderly woman spoke of eventually passing her own family's knowledge to him, ensuring that both Celtic and Asian wisdom would be preserved in the same caring hands. "Your wife chose her successor well," Mrs. Chen had told him recently. "You have learned to balance respect for tradition with openness to growth, exactly what these old practices need to survive." In the modern world, the oak tree itself had changed in subtle but significant ways since the completion ritual. Its leaves stayed green longer into autumn, its bark seemed to glow with inner warmth during winter months, and visitors often commented on the sense of peace they felt when standing beneath its massive canopy. Children were particularly drawn to it, as if recognizing something welcoming and protective in its ancient presence. Dr. Brightwater had become a regular visitor, documenting the family's traditions with scholarly precision while respecting their sacred nature. Her research was laying the groundwork for a broader understanding of how Celtic magical practices had evolved and survived in American immigrant communities. "Your family's story is rewriting academic assumptions about the preservation of folk traditions," she'd told Elias during her most recent visit. "What Sarah accomplished represents a perfect synthesis of old knowledge and new applications, something that most scholars believed was impossible." But beyond academic interest, the professor had become a friend who understood the weight of guardianship that Elias and Marcus had inherited. She served as a bridge between their private spiritual practices and the wider world that was slowly beginning to acknowledge the reality of traditions that transcended ordinary understanding. The house no longer felt empty, even when Elias was alone. Sarah's presence filled every room through the artifacts she'd created, the rituals she'd established, and the continuing conversations that flowed through the soul journal. He'd learned to distinguish between loneliness and solitude, between missing someone and staying connected to them across the boundary of death. As spring approached and plans solidified for Marcus and Eleanor's visit, Elias found himself looking forward to the future with an enthusiasm he hadn't felt since Sarah's diagnosis 30 years earlier. The seed would be planted, new traditions would begin, and the cycle of love and preservation would continue into another generation. Standing at the kitchen window with his morning coffee, writing his daily greeting to Sarah in the Soul Journal, Elias reflected on the journey that had brought him to this moment of peace and purpose. Some fathers leave their children money, others leave wisdom, but Sarah Ward had left her family something far more precious. She had left them proof that love truly is eternal, that death is merely a transformation, and that those we cherish never really leave us. They simply learn new ways to continue loving us across time and space. The oak tree swayed gently in the morning breeze, its ancient branches reaching toward a sky filled with infinite possibility. And Elias smiled as Sarah's voice spoke quietly through the pages of their continuing conversation. "Good morning, my beloved. Tell me about your dreams." The story that began with mystery and loss had become a testament to love's ultimate victory over every boundary, every fear, and every attempt to separate hearts that were meant to beat as one forever.